It was clear that we had to strike back in force. But where? Nimitz had a much smaller fleet than the enemy, and he was determined to use it. Where? The Coral Sea. Our forces met the enemy at Midway, too. The boldness and surprise of Nimitz's strategy in these two major engagements were enough to change the course of the war in the Pacific. The Battle of the Coral Sea and Midway were our first decisive victories. Nimitz expressed the gratitude of a nation when he decorated many of the Navy pilots and sailors who had helped turn back the enemy. As the war in the Pacific slowly changed from one of desperate defense to one of confident offense, the men who directed it found the need for careful coordination ever greater. The combined Navy and Army forces under both Nimitz and MacArthur worked smoothly to batter down the walls of Japan's Pacific Empire. But the war could not be viewed on maps, and the grand strategy which defeated the enemy could not all be planned within the conference room. On an inspection tour with Admiral Halsey and Navy Secretary Frank Knox, Nimitz conferred with combat veterans in the Solomons following our bitter 6-month struggle for Guadalcanal. On Kwajalein Island, Nimitz inspected what was left of Japanese defenses. After the American fleet and ground forces had hit the island, wrecked equipment and fire-scorched beaches told the story of our success. Before the Pacific fighting entered its final phase, with the recapture of the Philippines and the final thrust at the Japanese homeland, MacArthur and President Roosevelt met with Nimitz at CINCPAC headquarters in Hawaii. Our capture of Saipan immediately before the meeting meant that a major rupture had been accomplished in Japan's inner defense perimeter. Although Nimitz and the other American leaders were unaware of it at the time, the Japanese General Staff was already asking its government for a peace settlement with the United States. The Americans did know, however, that Premier Tojo had been forced to resign, and their confidence was high. Plans for retaking the Philippines were submitted and approved at this meeting. In spite of the enormous responsibility and pressure which bore down upon Nimitz during these busy and critical days, in spite of daily decisions involving thousands of lives, he remained the same gentle, dignified, humble man he had always been. Nimitz was always the ideal commander, the quiet Texan who had begun his task in the Pacific with a shattered fleet, a fleet which in less than 2 years was transformed into one of the world's great navies. Under his strong, imaginative guidance, men of the Navy fought a sea war such as no man had ever fought before, and many new names were added to the list of American naval great. Coaching them, counseling them all in the epic struggle for victory was Nimitz. On the 3rd anniversary of the attack at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz spoke to naval personnel and civilian workers who helped repair many of our wrecked vessels.
The job is not finished. The road to Tokyo is long and arduous, and we must tread it together all the way. On the mainland, our comrades must construct ships. You here must reconstruct ships. We of the fighting units must destroy ships, enemy ships. Construction, reconstruction, destruction.
For Nimitz, there was no relaxation of responsibility. His life was filled with the critical business of high command as the tempo of the war increased and the relentless tide of American sea power swept forward. And behind his task, behind the decisions which moved the fleet ever closer to Japan, was the constant evaluation, the continuous re-examination of his strategy. Under his direction, Halsey, Spruance, Turner, and others used their forces with masterly precision and deadly effect, setting the pace for subordinate commanders. At New Guinea and the Marianas, the enemy felt our power. Finally, the day came for the Philippines. The decision of Nimitz and MacArthur to skip the southern Philippine Islands paid off. And on October 20th, 1944, American soldiers stormed the Leyte beaches. As the Japanese prepared to defend themselves against the American attack, their adherence to a cause already lost carried them to fanatical excess. Few men on either side realized that the Leyte Gulf action, hoped for by Nimitz and earnestly sought by Halsey, would turn into one of the most far-reaching naval engagements of all time. We threw everything we had at the enemy, and his losses were staggering. Before the fighting ceased, the Leyte Gulf adventure cost the Japanese Navy 4 aircraft carriers, 9 destroyers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and all reasonable hope of ever winning a sea battle from the American fleet. For some of our men, too, Leyte Gulf was the last fight. Many brave Americans who died in this action were honored at sea by their comrades. The liberation of the Philippines soon became a certainty, and Nimitz urged his commanders forward. Halsey's carriers were both the cavalry and artillery of the Navy as they closed in upon the enemy. Island by island, American ground forces followed as the power of the Japanese war machine withered and began to die. But the Japanese were desperate men, and desperation breeds its own terrors. One of the most destructive was kamikaze, the spirit of the divine wind. We called them suicide planes. In the Philippines, they came like fierce hornets. They attacked alone and they attacked in bunches. For a while, it seemed they would never stop coming.